Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing David Ray Griffin's 9/11 Contradictions, an open letter to Congress and to the press. This book's on my all-time list because of the calm and simple way David Ray Griffin just goes through major holes in the official story of 9/11 and asks questions. At the end of each chapter, there's a conclusion. Please address these inconsistencies. Now, as you can see, it's a pretty thick book, and some of the stories, some of the questions he asks don't do as well, I think, in a book review format like this. So this is going to be a lengthy review, so if you want to grab a seat and grab a beverage of your choice, it's going to be a while. But I've had to make strategic choices about what I'm going to read and what I'm not going to. So obviously, as always with these book reviews, I want you to potentially pick up a book to read on your own. So I can't read the whole book to you, but I want to give you some interesting things to chew on, especially regarding 9/11. And allow you to go do your own research. So this is chapter 3. Was Cheney observed confirming a stand-down order? Norman Minetta's testimony. In his testimony to the commission, Minetta described the following episode. During the time that the airplane was coming into the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, "The plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out." And when it got down to "the plane is 10 miles out," the young man also said to the vice president, "Do the orders still stand?" And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" When asked by Commissioner Timothy Raymer how long this conversation occurred after he arrived, Minetta said, as we saw in the prior chapter, probably about 5 or 6 minutes. That, as Raymer pointed out, would have been about 9:25 or 9:26. One problem created by Minetta's testimony was that it implied that Cheney and members of the military knew that an aircraft was approaching Washington about 12 minutes before the Pentagon was struck. This directly contradicted the official account, according to which the military did not know that an aircraft was approaching the Pentagon until 9:36, so that it, in the words of the 9/11 Commission, had at most 1 or 2 minutes to react to the unidentified plane approaching Washington. Let's pause for a second. Even if it only had 1 or 2 minutes to react, are we expected to believe that the Pentagon doesn't have defense structures in place, can't call a jet? That's the narrative. Remember, we can talk about where the jets were and Vigilant Guardian and all the exercises that were running that day. But the point is that even if they only had 1 or 2 minutes, that should have been enough time for the Pentagon to do something defensive. That claim was essential for explaining, among other things, why the Pentagon had not been evacuated before it was struck, a fact that resulted in 125 deaths. Rumsfeld's spokesperson, when asked why this evacuation did not occur, said, "The Pentagon was simply not aware that this aircraft was coming our way." Even more problematic was the question of the nature of the, quote, orders. Minetta assumed, he said, that they were orders to have the plane shot down. But no plane approaching Washington was shot down, arguably. Another problem with Minetta's interpretation was that it made the episode unintelligible. Had Cheney given the expected order to have an aircraft approaching the ultra-restricted airspace over Washington shot down, there would have been, critics argued, no reason for the young man to ask if the order still stood. The question only made sense if the orders were to do something unusual, not to shoot it down. It was suggested accordingly that Minetta inadvertently reported having observed Cheney confirm stand-down orders, meaning orders to suspend the standard policy. The grounds for this suspicion were removed by the accounts given by Cheney's actions that morning by most mainstream media stories and subsequently the 9/11 Commission. The mainstream media stories in question all aired before Minetta testified to the 9/11 Commission in 2003. But Minetta had given this account of Cheney and the young man on a BBC program, Clear the Skies, which appeared on the first anniversary of 9/11. And he may have been telling it even earlier. Accordingly, insofar as several mainstream stories remove the grounds for suspicion that Minetta observed Cheney's confirmation of a stand-down order, they could have been responses to Minetta's story, even though they appeared before his 2003 testimony to the 9/11 Commission. One way to remove this suspicion involves simply portraying Cheney as not entering the PEOC until later. 3 prominent television shows on the first anniversary of 9/11, one by CNN and 2 by ABC, did portray Cheney as entering the PEOC early enough for the episode recounted by Minetta to have occurred. The two ABC shows even contained Monetta's account. But most television and newsprint accounts portray Cheney as arriving too late for the episode to have occurred, whether just before the Pentagon attack, just after it, or, as Evan Thomas's story in the December 31st, 2001 issue of Newsweek had it, not until 9:58. Although each of these three types of accounts contradicted the other two, they all ruled out the possible occurrence of Cheney's being asked, after being told that a plane was approaching the Pentagon about 12 minutes before it was attacked, whether the, quote, orders still stood. The 9/11 Commission then turned Evan Thomas's Newsweek account into the official position. According to this account, Mrs. Cheney arrived to meet the vice president in the corridor just after he had learned that the Pentagon had been hit, while he was speaking on the phone to the president. And then, Thomas said, shortly before 10 a.m., the Cheneys were led into the PEOC conference room. They looked up at the TV screens. It was 9:58 a.m. The 9/11 Commission report said there is conflicting evidence about when the vice president arrived in the shelter conference room. We have concluded from the available evidence that the vice president arrived in the room shortly before 10 a.m., perhaps at 9:58. There's more detail here, but I'm just going to go to the conclusion. There are three reasons to suspect that the most accurate account is the one given by Moneta. First, he had no obvious motive to lie. Second, he has recently, as pointed out in the previous chapter, reaffirmed his account, stating that the vice president, along with Mrs. Cheney, was already there when he arrived in the PEOC at about 9:20, and stating that the exchange between Cheney and the young man definitely occurred before the attack on the Pentagon. Third, the various alternative accounts appear to have been created primarily for the purpose of overcoming the impression, sure to be given by the episode reported by Moneta, that Cheney had confirmed orders not to shoot down an aircraft approaching the Pentagon. Congress and the press need to determine if Moneta's account is indeed true, and if it is, why and by whom the false accounts were created. That Norman Moneta account testimony for years has been damning, and I think that the actors involved knew that they couldn't kill Moneta because it wouldn't matter. Even if they had killed Moneta, it would first of all, there'd be more suspicion created, but secondly, they can't change the testimony. Moneta is not going to crawl up there and say, oh, by the way, I misremembered all of that, and the Cheneys weren't actually there at 9:20. He remembered what he remembered. This is Chapter 8. Did Ted Olson receive calls from Barbara Olson? On the afternoon of 9/11, CNN put out a story that began, Barbara Olson, a conservative commentator and attorney, alerted her husband, Solicitor General Ted Olson, that the plane she was on was being hijacked Tuesday morning. Ted Olson told CNN. According to this story, Olson reported that his wife had called him twice on a cell phone from American Airlines Flight 77, saying that all passengers and flight personnel, including the pilots, were herded to the back of the plane by armed hijackers. The only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. And honey, I just wanted to let you know, because even though it's 2001, somehow I'm able to make a cell phone call in the sky when that's not possible in 2025. No, I just made that up, but obviously that's what's implied here. Although this report was instrumental in the creation of the official story about 9/11, according to which the planes had been hijacked by terrorists armed with knives and box cutters, this report was contradicted strangely by Ted Olson himself, American Airlines, and the FBI. Olson's self-contradictions. Olson's own accounts contain self-contradictions. The main contradiction concerns the type of phone used by his wife. According to CNN, as we have seen, he said on September 11 that she had called him twice on a cell phone. On September the 14th, however, Olson told Fox News' Hannity and Combs that she reached him by calling the Department of Justice collect. She must therefore have been using the airplane phone because he surmised she somehow didn't have access to her credit cards. Can you imagine putting in a credit card? There's terrorists coming towards you with box cutters, but yes, you've got enough time to put in your credit card or to swipe it. On CNN's Larry King show later that same day, Olson returned to his first story. After saying that the second call from her suddenly went dead, he surmised that this was because the signals from cell phones coming from airplanes don't work that well. They don't work at all. You cannot make a call from a cell phone at cruising altitude. You couldn't do it in 2001, and you can't do it today. The technology doesn't work that way. You need a satellite phone to do something like that. On CNN's 2 months later, however, Ted Olson went back to his second story. In the Barbara K. Olson Memorial Lecture delivered to the Federalist Society, he said that she used a telephone in the airplane to make those 2 telephone calls. This story was then repeated in March 2002. Calling collect, he told the London Daily Telegraph his wife used the phone in the passenger seats. She called collect, he again surmised, because she didn't have her purse and hence her credit card. This revised version of his story evidently went virtually unnoticed in the American press. A year after 9/11, for example, CNN was still reporting that Barbara Olson had used a cell phone. Nevertheless, Ted Olson's statement to the Federalist Society and the Telegraph that she called collect using a passenger seat phone was apparently his final word on the matter. And I think part of the insulation here is because he's a grieving widower, and you're not going to question anything around the circumstances of your wife's death. But the reality is, if your wife who was going to die did call you, how could you possibly mess up how it was that she called you? And then keep contradicting yourself over and over. Even he's an attorney. He should know to get his facts straight and then to repeat that, even just from the outside. He clearly didn't get a memo, and he just kept changing his story, and you change your story when you lie. And this is clearly what is happening here. Olson is lying. The credibility of... going back to this, about the passenger seat phone. That, however, was a self-contradictory claim because it takes a credit card to activate an onboard phone. If she did not have a credit card, she would not have used a passenger seat phone, whether to call collect or otherwise. Some people have suggested that she reversed the charges because she had borrowed someone else's credit card. In that situation, however, speed would have been far more important than saving a few dollars. The credibility of Ted Olson's story is challenged, therefore, by this self-contradictory claim and also by the fact that the first version of his story, according to which his wife had used the cell phone, was contradicted by his final version. Olson's final version is contradicted by American Airlines. By settling on the assertion that his wife had used a passenger seat phone, nevertheless, Olson avoided having his story challenged by the assertion that, given the cell phone technology in 2001, cell phone calls from airliners were generally possible only if they were flying at a low altitude. For example, a story in Travel Technologist published 1 week after 9/11 said, wireless communication networks weren't designed for ground-to-air communication. Cellular experts privately admit that they're surprised the calls were able to be placed from the hijacked planes. They speculate that the only reason that the calls went through in the first place is that the aircraft were flying so close to the ground. This assumption that the planes from which cell phone calls were made on 9/11 must have been flying at very low altitudes was also stated by Brenda Rainey, a Verizon wireless spokesperson, who said the planes were flying low when people started using their phones. However, Barbara Olson's first call, according to the 9/11 Commission, which endorsed Ted Olson's story, occurred at some point between 9:16 and 9:26. According to the flight data recorder information released by the National Transportation Safety Board, Flight 77 would at those 2 times have been at about 25,000 feet and 14,000 feet respectively. That's not low to the ground at all. But although the final version of Olson's story avoided this problem, American Flight 77 was a Boeing 757, and according to American Airlines itself, this plane did not have onboard phones. One indication that this might have been the case is provided by the AA website, which, while informing travelers that telephone calls are possible on AA's Boeing 767 and 777, does not mention its 757. In 2004, 2 UK researchers asked American Airlines whether 757s are fitted with phones that passengers can use. An AA spokesperson replied, American Airlines 757s do not have onboard phones for passenger use. The researchers then asked, are there any onboard phones at all on AA 757s that could be used either by passengers or cabin crew? The response was, AA 757s do not have any onboard phones either for passenger or crew use. Crew have other means of communication available. It was possible, however, that although this was true in 2004, when the question was asked, it had not been true in September 2001. But in February of 2006, a German researcher sent American Airlines an email asking a more specific question. On your website, there is mentioned that there are no seatback satellite phones on a Boeing 757. Is that info correct? Were there any such seatback satellite phones on any Boeing 757 before or on September 11, 2001? And if so, when were those phones ripped out? Here is the reply. Thank you for contacting customer relations. I am pleased to have the opportunity to assist you. That is correct. We do not have phones on our Boeing 757. The passengers on Flight 77 used their own personal cellular phones to make outgoing calls during the terrorist attack. However, the pilots are able to stay in constant contact with the air traffic control tower. I hope this information is helpful. It is a privilege to serve you. Sincerely, Chad W. Kinder, Customer Relations, American Airlines. On May 31st, 2007, another researcher was able to reach Chad Kinder by telephone to ask if he had indeed written the reply. Kinder answered that he could not specifically recall having written that letter, which was sent over a year earlier, but he said, "That sounds like an accurate statement." Kinder indicated, in other words, that it was a letter he might well have written because what it said, the AA 757s in 2001 did not have onboard phones, so the passengers on American 77 had to use cell phones, was, to the best of his present knowledge, accurate. Accordingly, the final version of Ted Olson's story, according to which his wife called him from American 77 using an onboard telephone, was contradicted by a representative of American Airlines itself. Olson's story contradicted by the FBI. The 9/11 Commission report endorsed Ted Olson's story. The Commission did not specify whether the calls were made from a cell phone or an onboard phone, but it did cite an FBI report entitled American Airlines Airphone Usage, dated September 20th, 2001. According to this FBI report as cited by the Commission, however, there was apparently no reference to any calls from Barbara Olson or to the Department of Justice. Instead, it referred merely to 4 connected calls to unknown numbers. The 9/11 Commission then said, "The records available for the phone calls from American 77 do not allow for a determination of which of these 4 calls represent the 2 between Barbara and Ted Olson, although the FBI and DOJ believe that all 4 represent communications between Barbara Olson and her husband's office." That was a strange conclusion. If Ted Olson reported receiving only 2 calls, why would the Commission conclude that the DOJ had received 4 connected calls from his wife? That conclusion in any case was starkly contradicted by the evidence about phone calls from the 4 hijacked airliners presented by the U.S. government in 2006 at the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui. Far from attributing all 4 of the connected calls to unknown numbers to Barbara Olson, as the 9/11 Commission suggested, this government document attributed none of them to her, saying instead that each one was from an unknown caller. The only call attributed to Barbara Olson was an unconnected call to the Department of Justice, which was said to have been attempted at 9:18 and 58 seconds and to have lasted 0 seconds. According to the U.S. government in 2006, in other words, Barbara Olson attempted a call to the DOJ, but it did not go through. The federal government itself presented evidence in a court of law, accordingly, that contradicted Ted Olson's story, regardless of whether the calls were supposedly made from a cell phone or an onboard phone. It is certainly strange that Ted Olson's initial story, that he received 2 cell phone calls from his wife, was later contradicted by Olson himself. That his later story, according to which she had used an onboard phone to make these calls, was implicitly contradicted by American Airlines, and that both versions of his story were implicitly contradicted by the FBI, which is part of the very governmental department for which Olson formerly worked. Whatever be the explanation for these strange contradictions, however, they cry out for investigation by Congress and the press, as does the FBI's failure to make public its report, which contradicted the widely held view that cell phone calls had been made from American Flight 77. If you are enjoying this content, consider hitting like or subscribe, sharing this with other people. If you still believe the government story after hearing about Barbara Olson's fake calls and Norman Mineta's testimony against Dick Cheney's lies, I don't know what to tell you. Were Mohammed Atta and the other hijackers devout Muslims? According to the official story of 9/11, the planes were hijacked by devout Muslims ready to meet their maker. The 9/11 Commission report supported this picture, saying of Mohammed Atta, the supposed ringleader, that he had become very religious, even fanatically so. The image of Atta and the other alleged hijackers as devout Muslims contributed to the Commission's characterization of them as a cadre of trained operatives willing to die. But there have been many stories in mainstream newspapers that contradict the claim that they were devout Muslims. And here we have a story from the South Florida Sun Sentinel entitled "Suspects' Actions Don't Add Up." 3 guys cavorting with lap dancers at the Pink Pony Nude Theater. two others knocking back glasses of Stoli and rum and coke at a fish joint in Hollywood the weekend before committing suicide and mass murder. That might describe the behavior of several men who are suspects in Tuesday's terrorist attack, but it is not a picture of devout Muslims, experts say, let alone that of religious zealots in their final days on earth. A devout Muslim cannot drink booze or party at a strip club and expect to reach heaven, said Mahmoud Mustafa Ayub, a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. The most basic tenets of the religion forbid alcohol and any sex outside marriage. It is incomprehensible that a person could drink and go to a strip bar one night, then kill themselves the next day in the name of Islam, said Ayub. People who would kill themselves for their faith would come from very strict Islamic ideology. Something here does not add up. As the story pointed out, the behavior of these men seemed to contradict the idea that they were devout Muslims ready to kill themselves for their faith. One of the references in the just quoted Sun Sentinel story about two of the hijackers knocking back glasses of Stoli and rum and coke at a fish joint in Hollywood the weekend before, and this is Hollywood, for those of you outside the United States, there's a Hollywood, Florida, as well as a Hollywood, California, is worthy of special treatment because early reports of this episode were contradicted by later ones. The episode occurred on Friday, September 7th at a restaurant called Shuckums in Hollywood, Florida. According to early reports, Atta was drunk. On September the 12th, the Associated Press published a story by Ken Thomas based on an interview with the manager, Tony Amos. After reporting that Amos, having been shown photos of the two men, had identified the one signed Mohammed, Thomas wrote, Amos said that the two men had each consumed several drinks Friday night and had given the bartender a hard time. The guy Mohammed was drunk, his voice was slurred, and he had a thick accent, Amos said. Bartender Patricia Idrisi said the men argued over the bill, and when she asked if there was a problem, Mohammed said he worked for American Airlines and he could pay his bill. The next day, the St. Petersburg Times quoted the bartender to this effect, writing, Tony Amos, the night manager at Chuckham's Bar in Hollywood, told the Palm Beach Post that Atta argued with him over his tab. When Amos asked Atta whether he could pay, Atta got offended and said, I'm a pilot for American Airlines and I can pay my bill. Bartender Patricia Idrisi said. They were wasted, said Idrisi, who said she directed the two men to a Chinese restaurant a few doors down. They later returned and each ordered about 5 drinks, she said. And there's more. After Atta completed flight training at Huffman Aviation in December 2000, he and several other men rented an immense and beautiful house in Northport until they were evicted at the end of February 2001. During the weekend of February 25 to 28, Amanda Keller, who had decided to leave her husband, agreed to go to Key West with Atta, whom she had met while she was managing Papa John's Pizza. They were accompanied by 2 German men named Peter and Stefan, and a stripper named Linda. While in Key West, the 3 men used cocaine. Keller also reported that she saw Atta using cocaine, which he got from Huffman Aviation on other occasions. Keller confirmed, however, that Atta also drank heavily. Hopsicker, referring to the later modification of the Shuckums episode, said, It's not as if the Shuckums story was the only drinking incident. There were many. One day, Keller reported, Mohammed and a bunch of his cronies, drunk and stoned out of their minds, came to the place where she worked, screaming to see her. In any case, somewhere during this period, she and Atta had decided to share an apartment, which would be in her name, although he would pay the rent. Upon their return from Key West, a fight between Keller and her husband led to her being arrested and put in jail, after which Atta bailed her out. She then helped Atta move from the Northport house, from which he had been evicted, to a Northport rental unit owned by Tony and Vonnie Lakonka, where Atta lived for a week in early March, while she was finding a place for them to live. Keller and Atta then moved into Unit 26 of the Sandpiper Apartments, while Atta's friends took a downstairs unit. But things did not go well. Keller soon came to dislike Atta, but she had to put up with him because he was paying the rent. She admitted to Hopsicker that she was using Atta. Soon, however, she took a job as a stripper and private dancer at a place called Fantasies and Lingerie, where she started making $3,000 a week. Sometime after this, she met a much more attractive man named Garrett Metz, whom she started inviting to sleep over. She forced Atta to sleep on the couch, which led him to become increasingly abusive. No longer needing Atta's money, she soon, with the support of the apartment manager, kicked him out. Which, this is a story of every devout Muslim, right? The contradiction between the Commission's portrayal of Mohammed Atta and the other supposed hijackers as devout Muslims on the one hand, and their actual behavior as reported by a wide variety of sources on the other, is an issue that does need to be addressed. Congress and the press need to ask why this contradiction exists and why the 9/11 Commission failed to address it. And you have to think about how crucial that is. If these are devout Muslims trying to strike a blow against the great Satan, and instead they're just people who were paid patsies by larger intelligence agencies so that a narrative could be woven, then the story doesn't hold up. But even here, the story doesn't pass the basic smell test. You look at this and you say, how is he thinking as a devout Muslim? How is he acting as a devout Muslim, even according to the tenets of his own religion? Just an outsider. You don't have to be a Muslim to look and see this doesn't pass the smell test. What about evidence of bin Laden's responsibility? Remember, bin Laden is the person who orchestrated this from Afghanistan using a satellite phone. This is chapter 18. Is there hard evidence of bin Laden's responsibility? This is quoting Secretary of State Colin Powell. The Bush administration plans to make public evidence linking Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network to the terror attacks on the United States in an effort to persuade the world, and particularly Muslim nations, that a military response is justified. So they were quoting Powell from a press briefing he had given on September the 23rd, 2001. However, that same morning, Powell and President Bush, this is the next day, September the 24th, appearing together before the press in the White House Rose Garden, withdrew the pledge. Here's how the discussion went. Question: Mr. President, when will you publish the paper which Secretary Powell mentioned yesterday, outlining some of the proof that you have of the involvement of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and others? The President: the Secretary said that he'd be glad to talk about the paper. Let me first tell you, here's the distraction, let me first tell you that I gave a speech to the nation last Thursday in which I spent a great deal of time talking about the Al-Qaeda organization as the first terrorist organization that we're going to deal with. And the reason I did is there is a lot of classified information that leads to one person, as well as one global terrorist organization. But for those of you looking for a legal peg, we've already indicted Osama bin Laden. He's under indictment for terrorist activity. Mr. Secretary, if you'd like to make a comment on that. And Colin Powell says, I just might point out that he has been under indictment for the bombings of our embassy, and as we gather information, and as we talk to our friends and allies around the world, and as we get more cooperation, more information is coming in with respect to his activities and the activities of this network. Most of it is classified, and as we look through it, we can find areas that are unclassified and will allow us to share this information with the public. We will do so. That would be our intent. But most of it is classified. But there's no question that this network, with this gentleman at the head, is the one who is responsible. And as we are able to provide information that is not sensitive or classified, I think we will try to do that in every way. Accordingly, Powell, following Bush's lead, said that although there was a lot of information that pointed to bin Laden's responsibility, all such evidence available at this time was classified. But that they would try sometime in the future, like decades after the Kennedy assassination, to provide some unclassified evidence. Although Powell on Sunday had told Russert, so Tim Russert used to host Meet the Press, that he was absolutely certain of bin Laden's responsibility for 9/11. Well, the just trust me, bro, evidence. Bush and Powell on Monday emphasized that bin Laden had already been indicted for terrorist activity. This was what Bush said, and in particular the bombings of our embassy, which is what Powell said. And then this is posed that afternoon to Ari Fleischer, who was the press secretary for the president at the time. Ari, it does seem that across the board, on proving that bin Laden is behind these acts, the answer is always, that's classified, trust us. Does that really serve the democracy well if all this information on which the government is basing its actions is classified? Ari Fleischer, I think the American people get it. I think they understand that as the nation moves from a peacetime footing to a wartime footing, the government's need to hold certain pieces of information closer is an important need. Remember, the just trust me, bro, defense. Did the Blair government provide hard evidence of bin Laden's responsibility? The task of presenting public evidence was taken over by the British government. On October the 4th, Prime Minister Tony Blair presented a document entitled Responsibility for the Terrorist Atrocities in the United States. Listing clear conclusions reached by the government, it stated, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network which he heads, planned and carried out the atrocities on 11 September 2001. The document, however, begins with this statement. This document does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. It begins, in other words, by saying that it provides no hard evidence. The document does hint to be sure that such evidence exists. In its introductory statement, it says, the document does not contain the totality of the material known to HMG, given the continuing and absolute need to protect intelligence sources. Later, after presenting various kinds of circumstantial evidence, the document says, there is evidence of a very specific nature relating to the guilt of bin Laden and his associates that is too sensitive to release. But the document itself, by its own admission, does not provide evidence sufficient for a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. The weakness of the evidence was pointed out the following day by the BBC. In a report entitled The Investigation and the Evidence, it said, there is no direct evidence in the public domain linking Osama bin Laden to the 11 September attacks. At best, the evidence is circumstantial. The evidence is not being judged in a court of law. It only needs to persuade governments around the world to back the US-led war on terrorism, and to a lesser extent to carry public opinion. The evidence might be good enough to go to war, the BBC seemed to be saying, but it would not be good enough to go to court. In any case, the Blair government, like the Bush administration, did not provide hard evidence of bin Laden's responsibility for the attacks of 9/11. What about the FBI? The FBI has a website labeled Most Wanted Terrorists. Its page for Osama bin Laden states at the top, murder of U.S. nationals outside the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attack on a federal facility resulting in death. Down below it says, Osama bin Laden is wanted in connection with the August 7, 1998 bombings of the United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. These attacks killed over 200 people. In addition, bin Laden is a suspect in other terrorist attacks around the world. The FBI has another website labeled the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives, which has the same page on Osama bin Laden. On neither site is there any mention of the attacks of 9/11. On June 5, 2006, Muckraker Report editor Ed Haas, puzzled by this, contacted FBI headquarters to ask why. Rex Toome, who was then the FBI's chief of investigative publicity, reportedly replied, the reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on Osama bin Laden's Most Wanted page is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. When pressed to explain more fully, Toome reportedly said, bin Laden has not been formally charged in connection to 9/11. The FBI gathers evidence. Once evidence is gathered, it is turned over to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice then decides whether it has enough evidence to present to a federal grand jury. In the case of the 1998 United States embassies being bombed, bin Laden has been formally indicted and charged by a grand jury. He has not been formally charged and indicted in connection with 9/11 because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. But remember, he did it. Trust me, bro. From Toome's statement, we can infer that the FBI, like Colin Powell and Ari Fleischer on September the 24th, 2001, suggests that there is hard evidence of bin Laden's responsibility only for the embassy bombings in East Africa, but not for the 9/11 attacks. On the next day, June 6, 2006, in any case, Haas's Muckraker report quoted Toome's statements. The following day, Toome's no hard evidence statement was quoted on a news program, the International News Network World Report, after editor Claire Brown, by calling Toome, had confirmed the accuracy of the quotation. On August the 20th, 2006, Haas wrote a follow-up essay in which he asked why the government has yet to legally produce the evidence required to gain a federal indictment of Osama bin Laden, adding, after all, the evidence threshold for gaining a federal indictment is much lower than for gaining a conviction. Yet for reasons that remain obscure for the public record, the U.S. government has not gained such an indictment of Osama bin Laden. And why? Because they didn't have it. Chapter 19, if you're still with me, please hit like or subscribe. And there's that hype feature now. Don't know too much about it, but consider hitting that as well. Chapter 19, could Hani Hanjour have flown American 77 into the Pentagon? One of the central elements in the 9/11 story, as told by the government, the press, and the 9/11 Commission, is that American Flight 77, a Boeing 757, was piloted by a young Saudi named Hani Hanjour. This claim is challenged, however, by numerous reports in the press, some of which are even reflected in the 9/11 Commission report, that imply Honjour would have been incapable of flying a Boeing 757 through the trajectory reportedly taken by American 77. That trajectory, according to experts, would have required a very skillful pilot, and yet Honjour, according to all reports, was a terrible pilot, even in a tiny plane. The 9/11 Commission report wrote, at 9:34, Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport advised the Secret Service of an unknown aircraft heading in the direction of the White House. American 77 was then 5 degrees southwest of the Pentagon and began a 330-degree turn. At the end of the turn, it was descending through 2,200 feet, pointed towards the Pentagon and downtown Washington. The hijacker pilot then advanced the throttles to maximum power and dove toward the Pentagon. The Commission later identified this hijacker pilot as Hani Hanjour. An interesting but little-known fact is that Hanjour's name was not included on the first FBI list of hijackers that was reported. That list, as stated orally by journalist Kelly Arena in a CNN breaking news report at about 10 a.m. on September the 14th, included a name that, based on her pronunciation, was transcribed as Mozear Khaned. On a list released by CNN at 2 p.m. the same day, however, that name had been replaced by Hanjour's. On September the 19th, a Washington Post story seeking to explain why Hanjour's name was not on the American Airlines manifest for the flight suggested that he may not have had a ticket, which would raise the question as to how he got on board. Be that as it may, Hanjour was quickly identified not only as one of the hijackers, but also as the one who flew the plane back toward Washington and then into the Pentagon. Prior to the time that Hanjour was identified as the pilot, Flight 77's trajectory in its final minutes had already been described as one requiring considerable skill. In a Washington Post story appearing on September the 12th, for example, Mark Fisher and Don Phillips wrote, just as the plane seemed to be on a suicide mission into the White House, the unidentified pilot executed a pivot so tight that it reminded observers of a fighter jet maneuver. The plane circled 270 degrees to the right to approach the Pentagon from the west. Aviation sources that the plane was flown with extraordinary skill, making it highly likely that a trained pilot was at the helm, or, as I would argue, that it was a drone. The following day, September the 13th, a story by John Hanchett said, whoever flew at least 3 of the death planes seemed very skilled. Investigators are particularly impressed with the pilot who slammed into the Pentagon and just before impact performed a tightly banked 270-degree turn at low altitude with almost military precision. The fact that this maneuver required great skill was reinforced by subsequent reports. 10 days after the attacks, a CBS report said that the difficult high-speed descending turn was so smooth and that the hijacker's flying skills must have been very good. Then, in October, Barbara Walters interviewed Danielle O'Brien, an air traffic controller at Dulles International Airport, who had been in the radar room on the morning of 9/11. Recounting how she had seen an unidentified plane to the southwest of Dulles, moving at a very high rate of speed toward the protected airspace over Washington, she said, the speed, the maneuverability, the way that he turned, we all thought in the radar room, all of us experienced air traffic controllers, that this was a military plane. And it very well could have been. But although the trajectory of the aircraft suggested that the pilot had extraordinary ability, stories making clear that Hani Hanjour was anything but a highly skilled pilot soon started appearing. On September the 19th, Justin Paprocki of the Capitol News Service, and it's amazing, this is back when we had journalists, back when we had people willing to dig up a story. This is almost a historical artifact in and of itself, that there used to be people who were not bought out by Israel. I'm sorry, are we not allowed to mention that in regards to 9/11? I'll make sure I don't say that again. On September the 19th, Justin Paprocki of the Capitol News Service published a story in the Maryland Newsline about the post-9/11 financial losses suffered by owners of small airfields in Maryland. This story contained a paragraph mentioning one of these airfields, Freeway Airport, near Bowie and Mitchellville. Freeway Airport evaluated suspected hijacker Hani Hanjour when he attempted to rent a plane. He took 3 flights with the instructors in the second week of August, but flew so poorly he was rejected for the rental, said Marcel Bernard, chief flight instructor at Freeway. He couldn't even rent a plane. On September the 21st, a story in a newspaper in Greenbelt, Maryland gave more detail, saying, Marcel Bernard, the airport manager and chief flight instructor at Freeway Airport in Mitchellville, Maryland, told FBI agents investigating last week's suicide attacks that Honjur had flown with flight instructors in single-engine Cessna 172s on 3 occasions over the last 6 weeks. Honjur had inquired recently about renting an airplane at Freeway to fly solo, but was declined after 2 different instructors questioned his flying ability. His flying skills were so poor overall that instructors declined to rent a plane to him without future training, Bernard said. 2 days later, on September the 23rd, a story in Newsday made this information national. In America's Ordeal, Tracing Trail of Hijackers, Thomas Frank wrote, "At Freeway Airport in Bowie, Maryland, 20 miles west of Washington, flight instructor Sherry Baxter instantly recognized the name of alleged hijacker Hani Honjur when the FBI released a list of 19 suspects in the 4 hijackings. Honjur, the only suspect on Flight 77, the FBI listed as a pilot, had come to the airport 1 month earlier seeking to rent a small plane. However, when Baxter and fellow instructor Ben Connor took the slender, soft-spoken Honjur on 3 test runs during the second week of August, they found he had trouble controlling and landing the single-engine Cessna 172. Even though Honjur showed a federal pilot's license, where did he get that? And a logbook cataloging 600 hours of flying experience, 600 hours, but he couldn't control and land a single-engine plane. Where did he get his flight logs modified? Chief flight instructor Marcel Bernard declined to rent him a plane without more lessons. On October the 15th, the Washington Post lifted up the problem even further in a story entitled Honjur, A Study in Paradox. Besides mentioning several incidents in which instructors had questioned his competence, including the refusal of Freeway Airport to rent a plane to Honjur, this story said, "How and where Honjur obtained a commercial pilot's license remains a lingering question that FAA officials refuse to discuss." I can't imagine why. The following year, reports of Honjur's incompetence received even greater national exposure. On May the 4th, 2002, Jim Yardley, in a New York Times story entitled "A Trainee Noted for Incompetence," wrote, "Hani Honjur was reported to the aviation agency in February 2001 after instructors at his flight school in Phoenix had found his piloting skills so shoddy and his grasp of English so inadequate that they questioned whether his pilot's license was genuine." Yardley's story ended with a quotation from a former employee of the flight school who was, he said, amazed that Honjur could have flown into the Pentagon because, quote, "he could not fly at all." This narrative makes sense if this person is being groomed as a patsy. Here he is, he took some flight lessons, and look, he flew the plane into the Pentagon. Mohammed Atta, he's a devout Muslim, and that's why he did it, except he is living with a woman and drinking and doing coke. The people who constructed these narratives really didn't think through the possibility that anyone was going to question or investigate this. They thought the national trauma would prevent investigation, but we already see on September the 14th, September the 19th, questions are being asked. So the chapter concludes, the claim that Hani Honjur piloted American 77 into the Pentagon is inconsistent with all media reports about his piloting ability. Neither the 9/11 Commission nor Popular Mechanics has resolved this contradiction. Congress and the press need to ask why this contradiction exists and why the 9/11 Commission allowed it to go unresolved. If you're still here and you are watching instead of just listening, you will notice that the light has changed pretty dramatically, and that's not a conspiracy. It's simply because the recording that I was using broke down. I had an appointment, I had to go take care of that, and now I'm coming back to re-record this part again. So it's me still, no worries. As I said, if you haven't already done that, hit the like button, subscribe, use that hype feature if you have it enabled, and get this out to more people who are interested in 9/11. Another feature, this is from Chapter 20, What Caused the Hole in the C-Ring. Another feature of the Pentagon strike, concerning which a contradiction has emerged, involves a round hole, about 9 feet in diameter, that was created in the Pentagon's C-Ring in Wedge 2. This hole was at about the place a projectile continuing the attacking aircraft's reported trajectory would have hit, approximately 310 feet from the impact zone. What could have caused this hole? The original explanation. The original explanation was that this hole was created by Flight 77's nose. Although the strike zone was in Wedge 1 of the Pentagon, Flight 77's reported trajectory was such that by the time it reached the third of the Pentagon's 5 rings, the C-ring, it would have been in Wedge 2. 2 days after 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, appearing on ABC's Good Morning America, said, "The plane came in, between about the first and second floor, and it went in through 3 rings. I'm told the nose is still in there, very close to the inner courtyard, about 1 ring away. 2 days later, Lee Evey, the program manager for the Pentagon renovation project, said at a Pentagon news briefing, the plane actually penetrated through the E-ring, D-ring, and C-ring. The nose of the plane just barely broke through the inside of the C-ring, so it was extending into AE drive a little bit. The press also gave this explanation. A Newsweek story on September the 28th, for example, said, the Boeing 757, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the southwestern corner of the monolithic 5-sided landmark at speeds estimated at 450 miles per hour, cutting a 100-foot wide wedge through the 5 floors of the outermost E-ring and penetrating into the D and C rings as well. Although this report did not specifically mention the nose, it did say that the plane penetrated into the C ring, and the nose would have presumably been leading the way. Although this explanation was generally accepted, it contained a problem which led critics to question it. The problem is that the nose of a 757 is very fragile. Therefore, critics argued, the nose of Flight 77 could not have gone through the outer E-ring wall with its steel reinforced concrete, and it certainly could not thereafter have punched out a large hole in the C-ring wall with its steel mesh and 8 inches of brick. French critic Thierry Maison, for example, made this argument writing, the nose of a plane contains the electronic navigation system. In order to allow passage of the waves emitted by the apparatuses, it is not made of metal, but of carbon fibers. It is thus extremely fragile and would be crushed rather than piercing through. Mason used this as one of the arguments for his claim that the Pentagon was instead struck by a missile, the type used to pierce bunkers. But the nose cone theory was also questioned by critics who did not share Mason's missile theory. Although Mason's missile theory would be widely attacked even by the U.S. State Department, his negative claim that the hole in the C-ring could not have been caused by the nose of a Boeing 757 would eventually carry the day. And it goes into more detail, but the conclusion, an exploration of the origin of the hole in the C-ring leads, as we have seen, to several questions, such as, if the hole was caused by Flight 77's nose cone, why was this cone said by Lee Evey to be sticking out of the hole, but said by Kevin Schaefer to be resting up against the B-ring wall? And if, as the ASCE's Pentagon Building Performance Report said, the landing gear ended up about 10 feet short of the C-ring, why did at least 2 officers report seeing it out in AE drive? But the central question is, if the hole was not caused by Flight 77's nose cone, as the ASCE report implied and Popular Mechanics explicitly said, because this nose cone would have disintegrated long before reaching the C-ring, why did Rumsfeld and Evey report that the nose cone not only created the hole, but was still visible afterwards? Like it was made out of diamond. Congress and the press need to find out why this and the related contradictions exist. Chapter 22. How did Rudy Giuliani know the towers were going to collapse? One of the most surprising features of 9/11 was the fact that the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center completely collapsed. Because these collapses were so unexpected, it was also surprising to learn that Rudy Giuliani, then the mayor of New York City, reported that he had been told in advance that the towers were going to collapse. While being interviewed on 9/11 by Peter Jennings, then the anchor at ABC News, Giuliani discussed what happened after his people at the Office of Emergency Management had evacuated their command center on the 23rd floor of WTC 7 that morning. We set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management, and we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10-15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out. The South Tower, the first building to collapse, did so at 9:59 a.m., Giuliani said. Therefore, that shortly before 9:59, he was told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. Although in the intervening years, there was no public questioning of Giuliani about this remark, WNBC reported that in May 2007, he was asked about it by a small group of people with a video camera. A young woman, after reminding him of what he had told Peter Jennings and of the fact that no steel structure in history has ever collapsed due to a fire, asked, "How come people in the buildings weren't notified? And who else knew about this?" Giuliani replied, "I didn't know the towers were going to collapse." A male member of the group then reminded Giuliani that he had indeed said, during his conversation with Peter Jennings, that he had been notified in advance that the towers were going to collapse. The man then asked, "Who told you the towers were going to collapse in advance, sir?" Giuliani replied, "I didn't realize the towers would collapse. Our understanding was that over a long period of time, the way other buildings collapsed, the towers would collapse, meaning over a 7, 8, 9, 10-hour period. No one that I know of had any idea they would implode. That was a complete surprise." This explanation, it must be said, seems more a revision than a clarification, because Giuliani's statement to Jennings, "We were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse, and it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building," did suggest that he had expected an imminent collapse. Be that as it may, Giuliani's answer suggested that the expectation had a historical basis. Was there in fact a historical basis for an expectation that the towers would come down, whether immediately or after 7 to 10 hours? According to experts, it seems, there was not. In 2001, New York Times reporter James Glanz wrote, "Experts said no modern steel-reinforced high-rise had ever collapsed because of an uncontrolled fire." In 2002, Robert F. Shea, the acting administrator of FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, testified to the House of Representatives Committee on Science, which was holding hearings on the WTC collapses. Speaking on the basis of his experience of 25 years, he said, "The World Trade Center was, frankly, an anomaly. No one who viewed it that day, including myself, believed that those towers would fall. Since an anomaly is something that contravenes known laws, it was a good term for the collapse of the Twin Towers because fire had never caused the total collapse of a steel frame high-rise building." In 1988, for example, a fire in the First Interstate Bank building in Los Angeles raged for 3.5 hours. Although it gutted 5 of this building's 62 floors, it caused no significant structural damage. That example by itself would suggest that there would have been no reason for anyone at the World Trade Center that morning to expect that the North and South Towers would collapse after burning only 102 and 56 minutes, respectively. What about, however, Giuliani's later statement that he and his people had expected them to collapse over a 7, 8, 9, 10-hour period? In 1991, a huge fire in Philadelphia's One Meridian Plaza lasted for 18 hours and gutted 8 of the building's 38 floors. Beams and girders sagged and twisted under severe fire exposures, said the FEMA report, but the columns continued to support their loads without obvious damage. Back in 1975, moreover, there had been a fire in the World Trade Center's North Tower. It caused damage on 10 floors, and the effort to extinguish it was described as like fighting a blowtorch. But the building survived with minor damage. The history of fires in steel frame high-rise buildings, therefore, would have provided no one a basis for expecting the towers to collapse. But the towers, of course, had been hit by airplanes. Should this fact have led someone to expect them to collapse? These buildings, it was well known, had been designed to handle the impact of a large jetliner. In 1964, when the towers were being designed, 2 analyses were carried out to determine how well they would stand up to being hit by one. Several people involved in building the towers had commented on this feature of their design. Leslie Robertson, who was a member of the architectural firm Worthington, Skilling, Hell & Jackson that designed the Twin Towers, said they had been designed to withstand the impact of a large airliner. The architect who was primarily responsible for the structural design, John Skilling, discussed in 1993, after the WTC bombing, what would happen if one of the towers were to suffer a strike by an airliner loaded with jet fuel. Although there would be a horrendous fire, and a lot of people would be killed, Skilling said, the building structure would still be there. In January of 2001, Frank DiMartini, who had been the on-site construction manager for the Twin Towers, said of each of them, "I believe that the building could probably sustain multiple impacts of jetliners." New York City also had historical experience to draw on. In 1945, a B-25 had struck the Empire State Building at the 79th floor, creating a hole 20 feet high. But this damage, though it caused a large fire, did not result in even a partial collapse. A B-25 is, to be sure, much smaller than a Boeing 67, but the Twin Towers were also much bigger than the Empire State Building. The important fact revealed in the 9/11 oral histories, in any case, is that the word that the towers were going to collapse evidently originated at the Office of Emergency Management. How was this office related to Giuliani? The director of the OEM, who at that time was Richard Shirer, reported directly to Giuliani. So although Giuliani said that he and others at 75 Barclay Street were told that the towers were going to collapse, it was his own people who were doing the telling. How would they have known this when there was a virtually universal belief that a total collapse of the towers would have been impossible, something that would not even enter one's mind? Congress and the press need to do what the 9/11 Commission failed to do. Ask Giuliani what he and his people in the OEM knew that other people did not know. Chapter 23, were there explosions in the Twin Towers? There's a lot of testimony here. I can't read all of it, but I'm just going to give a smattering for both the South and the North Tower so that we get an idea of the testimony. But there's too much testimony for me to read all of it. And at some point, we're going to have to get to the end of this review and get you back to whatever it is you were doing before you started watching. Shortly after 9/11, as we saw in the previous chapter, 9/11 oral histories were recorded of some 500 members of the fire department of New York. These testimonies were then made available to the public by the New York Times in 2005. Many of these testimonies, almost 1/4 of them by one count, included descriptions of phenomena suggestive of explosions going off in the Twin Towers before and during their collapses that could not plausibly be explained as resulting from the impact and fire. The FDNY includes, as we have seen, emergency medical workers as well as firefighters. Beginning with the latter, we will look first at testimony about the South Tower, also known as Tower 2, which was the second tower to be hit, although the first to collapse. Explain the science and physics behind that, exactly. These testimonies are simply given in alphabetical order. Firefighter Richard Banashki said, "There was just an explosion. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions." Firefighter Edwin Kachia said, "As my officer and I were looking at the South Tower, it just gave. It actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit. We originally had thought there was like an internal detonation, explosives, because it went in succession. Boom, 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 boom. And then the tower came down." Another firefighter, Craig Carlson, said, "You just heard explosions coming from Building 2, the South Tower. It seemed like it took forever, but there were about 10 explosions. We then realized the building started to come down." Fire Marshal John Coyle said, "The tower was, it looked to me, I thought it was exploding, actually. That's what I thought for hours afterwards, that it had exploded or there had been some device on the plane that had exploded because the debris from the tower had shot out far over our heads." And this is discussed in 9/11 Mysteries, which I've discussed in a film club review. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card if I haven't already mentioned it. But there's the question of a fire throwing debris that embeds in other buildings. That's not possible. That's not the force of a fire. That's the force of an explosion. And if you have a number of explosions pushing out that energy, that's what can happen. But you can't get explosions just from a fire causing a building to collapse. You just light anything on fire and let it collapse. It doesn't cause an explosion. You have to have explosives to cause an explosion. Now, if you're telling me that firefighters don't know what booms sound like, or they don't know what explosions are, that's up to you. And I don't think that all these firefighters got together and colluded to come up with some fake stories. So that's what you'd have to believe in order to believe that all of these separate testimonies of booms would be false. I choose not to believe that. Captain Karen DeShore, the commander at FDNY's Emergency Medical Services at the North Tower, said, "Somewhere around the middle of the North Tower, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. The popping sound, and with each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all around the building on both sides as far as I could see. These popping sounds and the explosions were getting bigger, going both up and down and then all around the building. So here these explosions are getting bigger and louder and bigger and louder, and I told everybody if this building totally explodes, still unaware that the other building had collapsed, I'm going in the water. Sue Keene, a police officer for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, said while discussing her experiences during the collapse of the North Tower, "There was another explosion. That sent me and the 2 firefighters down the stairs. I can't tell you how many times I got banged around. Each one of those explosions picked me up and threw me. There was another explosion, and I got thrown with 2 firefighters out into the street." What are these explosions? They're there weakening the structure to get ready for a demolition. We've seen this. It's all demonstrated. You can find it on the internet, not related to the World Trade Center. Just look at any demolition. This is how this works. And they talk about a belt going around in a circle. Here's what the media had to say as they were watching this. CNN's Aaron Brown, looking at the towers, said, "There has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower. But here was a cascade of sparks and fire, and it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion." ABC's anchor Peter Jennings said after the collapse of the South Tower, "Anyone who has ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of the building to bring it down." The media hasn't been told the story, so they're just watching this happen, and they're giving you their reflections, and Peter Jennings is saying, well, in order to do this, they had to have planted bombs in order to bring this down. He's making what any normal person would do in connecting the dots. And then we were told later, no, that's all conspiracy theories. How could you possibly think that? But this is the first reaction to Peter Jennings, known conspiracy theorist. Here's Lou Dobbs, who at the time was at CNN. "This was the result of something that was planned. It's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know." Peter Jennings, interviewing Marlene Cruz, a carpenter who was injured in the basement of the North Tower, asked what was happening to her. She said, "I was going to go do a job, and I got on the freight elevator, and I heard the first explosion, and the elevator blew up. The doors blew up, and it dropped. I was lucky that the elevator got caught between 2 floors. I was laying on the floor about 40 minutes. I didn't expect this bombing to occur after the first one in 1993. But when I heard that explosion, the first thing I thought was, here we go again, another bomb." Chapter 24. Were there explosions in WTC-7? Reports of explosions in WTC-7. Some of this testimony consisted of reports pointing to the occurrence of explosions in Building 7. One such report came from Peter DeMarco, a New York Daily News journalist, who said, "At 5:30 there was a rumble. The building's top row of windows popped out. Then all the windows on the 39th floor popped out. Then the 38th floor, pop, 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 was all you heard until the building sunk into a rising cloud of gray." And there's a note, seek, for 5:30. Obviously it wasn't 5:30. Mr. DeMarco got the time wrong. Another such report came from Al Jones, a reporter for WINS NYC News Radio, who said, "People started to run away from the scene, and I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. Looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself, and another big, huge plume of gray and white smoke shooting up into the air, and then more of the smoke billowing up the street here." So that's number 1, number 2, and now number 7 that have come down from the explosion. So you also have the testimony of Barry Jennings. That's someone else who has been attacked. He is covered in Loose Change. If I haven't already put a playlist for 9/11, I'll do that here, and I'll put one in the description as well. But Barry Jennings, someone who dared to tell the truth, and we don't really know what happened to him as a result. He was with someone else, Michael Hess, on the day of 9/11 in Building 7, and they came to an empty office with, Jennings said, half-eaten sandwiches and coffee that still had steam rising. Michael Hess, New York City's Corporation Counsel, had gone to the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor of WTC-7. During a live interview at 11:34 that morning with Frank Ucciardo of UPN 9 News, Hess said, "I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor when all the power went out in the building. Another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion, and we were trapped on the 8th floor with smoke. thick smoke all around us for about an hour and a half. But the New York Fire Department just came and got us out. If the explosion that trapped Hess and the other gentlemen had occurred about 90 minutes before they were rescued, as Hess estimated, it must have occurred before 10 o'clock. This conclusion can be confirmed by looking at the testimony of the other gentleman to whom Hess referred, Barry Jennings, who was the deputy director of the Emergency Services Department for the New York City Housing Authority, His experience was briefly described in an Associated Press story appearing on 9/11 itself that said, after the initial blast, Housing Authority worker Barry Jennings, 46, reported to a command center on the 23rd floor of 7 World Trade Center. He was with Michael Hess, the city's corporation counsel, when they felt and heard another explosion. First calling for help, they scrambled downstairs to the lobby, or what was left of it. I looked around. The lobby was gone. It looked like hell, Jennings said. The initial blast referred to the crash into the North Tower, which occurred at 8:46 a.m. According to Jennings' statement to the Associated Press, therefore, he and Hess would have arrived at the 23rd floor of WTC-7 at some time close to 9 o'clock. It might be assumed, therefore, that when they heard another explosion, they were hearing the airplane crash into the South Tower, which occurred at 9:03. That assumption would be challenged, however, by Jennings' own accounts. One of those accounts was given in a program on Penn State Public Broadcasting early in 2002. In this account, Jennings said, well, me and Mr. Hess, the corporation counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him, we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor, and I turned to Hess. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here. I took a fire extinguisher, and I bust the window out. That's when this gentleman here heard my cries for help. This gentleman right here. And he kept saying, stand by. Somebody's coming to get you. They couldn't get to us for an hour because they couldn't find us. It would be hard to interpret an explosion that blew them backwards and made them fear for their lives as an airplane crashed into the South Tower almost 200 yards away. It must have been an explosion in WTC-7. That was indeed the case. That this was indeed the case is confirmed by a later account in which Jennings said, upon arriving into the OEM EOC, Office of Emergency Management, Emergency Operating Center, we noticed that everybody was gone. I saw smoke was still coming off the coffee. I saw half-eaten sandwiches. And after I called several individuals, one individual told me to leave and to leave right away. What did that person know? So we subsequently went to the stairwell and were going down the stairs. When we reached the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up, and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. After getting to the 8th floor, everything was dark. Both buildings were still standing. Because I looked one way, looked the other way, when I got to the 6th floor, before all this happened, there was an explosion. That's what forced us back to the 8th floor. Both buildings were still standing. Jennings spoke more about this in his later statement about the lobby being gone. I'm just confused about one thing, why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was the fuel oil tank, it would have been on one side of the building. When I got down to the lobby after being rescued from the 8th floor, the lobby was totally destroyed. It looked like King Kong had come through and stepped on it, and it was so destroyed that they had to take me out through a hole in the wall. According to Jennings, therefore, the lobby had been destroyed by something that could not have simply been the explosion of WTC-7's fuel oil tank. How convenient that would happen in the first place. What would have caused the explosion of the fuel oil tank? The lobby was destroyed because explosions were happening in the building, preparing it for demolition. The testimonies about explosions in WTC-7 by Hess, Jennings, and the other people quoted above, which contradict NIST's statements, have not been widely reported. Something else that has hardly been reported is that there was little effort to put out the fires in WTC-7 because the building was expected to collapse. This fact does not, however, contradict NIST's position because one of its documents said, according to the FDNY first-person interviews, firefighting was never started in WTC-7. When the chief officer in charge of WTC-7 got to Barclay Street and West Broadway, numerous firefighters and officers were coming out of WTC-7. These firefighters indicated that several blocks needed to be cleared around WTC-7 because they thought the building was going to collapse. Why would the building collapse? One question that NIST should answer is how some people, such as some OEM personnel, could have known many hours in advance that WTC-7 would collapse. One possible answer would be that they knew this because they knew the building had been wired to be brought down by explosives. Is there any testimony to support this view? There has been much discussion about a statement made by Larry Silverstein, the builder and owner of WTC-7. In a PBS documentary in 2002, he said, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure that they were going to be able to contain the fire. They hadn't even started fighting the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made the decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse." If Silverstein's statement meant what it appears to mean, that the building was deliberately brought down, then we have a clear contradiction between his statement and NIST's preliminary report. It would, of course, be puzzling as to why Silverstein, who was hoping to receive several $billion in insurance money for the destruction of the World Trade Center on the assumption that the buildings had been brought down by terrorists, would have publicly admitted that one of the buildings was brought down by explosives at his own suggestion. And indeed, a spokesperson for Silverstein has claimed that by it, Silverstein meant not WTC-7, but the contingent of firefighters remaining in the building. Because that's what everybody says when you say, I'm going to make a decision to pull it, you're referring to human beings, right? This is what Silverstein expects us to believe. Be that as it may, the idea that this building was deliberately brought down was unequivocally expressed by Indira Singh, a senior consultant for JP Morgan Chase, who on 9/11, serving as a volunteer emergency medical worker, was in charge of setting up triage sites. In 2005, while Singh was being interviewed by Bonnie Faulkner, the producer and host of the Guns and Butter radio show, the following exchange occurred. "Pretty soon after midday on 9/11, we had to evacuate the site where we had been working because they told us Building 7 was coming down. I do believe that they brought Building 7 down because I heard that they were going to bring it down because it was unstable because of the collateral damage. That I don't know. I can't attest to the validity of that. All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we need to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or be brought down." Faulkner: "Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?" Singh: The fire department, and they did use the words, we're going to have to bring it down." So Indira Singh, besides supporting Chief Fellini's statement that the collapse expectation was being expressed already by about noon, also provided a possible answer to why some people had that expectation. And here's Peter Jennings. On that same day, the fact that the collapse of WTC-7 at least appeared to have been produced by explosives was expressed at the time by CBS anchor Dan Rather, who said, "Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, where a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down." People with greater expertise than Dan Rather, moreover, have said that the collapse not only looked like, but indeed was, a controlled demolition. Conclusion: Congress and the press need to ask why NIST has, by denying that there was any evidence that WTC-7 was brought down by controlled demolition, ignored the evidence, supplied by reporters and city employees, that explosions occurred in the building. They need to ask why NIST's and Rudy Giuliani's accounts of the experience of Michael Hess and Barry Jennings differ so greatly from the men's own accounts. Congress and the press also need to ask people in Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management what objective basis they had for telling the fire chiefs that WTC-7 was going to collapse. They need to ask, finally, if the contradictions discussed here are related to the repeated delays in NIST's issuance of a report on the collapse of this building. 9/11 Contradictions by David Ray Griffin. If you want a copy of this book, even though it's from 2007, I still think all of the points still hold up. There's been a lot of research since that time. 9/11 truth has gone a lot further, but I think this book still holds up very, very well. If you want to get a copy of it, there's a link in the description. That's one of the ways that you can support this channel. You can also, as I have said, I think at least a couple times already, hit like, subscribe, hype, share this with people who you think would benefit and are at least open-minded enough to hear about 9/11 and be willing to take a little bit of time to dig into it. They'll know a lot more about it after reading this, that's for sure. If you'd like to thank me for this presentation, there's links to Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. If you'd like to get early releases of videos like this one, as well as the opportunity to chat with me one-on-one each month, There's Patreon and YouTube membership, so where you can support the channel on an ongoing basis. And if you want to buy a book to sponsor a video in the future, my Amazon wish list is below. You can click on that. You'll see all sorts of books, including those on Palestine for my Palestine bookshelf project, if you'd like to go check that out. But if you buy the book, send it my way. I will do my best to review it in a timely manner. Until next time, enjoy your reading.